It was almost noon when Jacqueline Crow was led to the oak tree where hung the gallows. Forever condemned as a witch, the witch of old Willow, a tear betrayed her young face at her folly, hearing still the vicious accusations that they cast upon her in a merciless volley. 12 times the bells clanged. Upon the last she was hanged. She began to cry, the noose not allowing her to die. She feared she would hear the vile persecutions forevermore. The devil's devout whore. By no ear were Jacqueline's cries met with mercy, having marked her every uttered word as perverse heresy. Tighter the lethal hemp dug into her pale skin, deaf yet not relieving her of her wrongfully accused sin. In the corner of her oceanic eye, the dark shadow in the crowd she did spy. She could hear his voice, the blasphemous sound. Her dread was now unbound. She could hear him now, goading her in her desperate sorrow. Say it, my sweet dear, pledged to by my black hand follow. With kerosene and fire, her persecutors sated their murderous intent. Her cries and pleas for mercy were all but spent. 2 sparks in the pyre neath her bare feet was alight. Dread pervaded her at the recollection of that sad, grave night. Through the woods, she and her lover would tread. In those woods, his pledge of undying love to her was said. In the eyes of her lover, she was helplessly entranced. Around a fire, they all night danced. Out of sight, behind the tall pine, there stalked the shadow, fouler than the filthiest swine. It watched the lovers in their play. With vulpine exhortation, he plotted to, with her, have his way. In her slumber he beckoned, urging to her to allow unto him her innocence be reckoned. His cunning tongue fueled his charade, appearing to her as a sweet serenade. Entranced, she blindly followed the siren call. That night, laid beneath the spirits, her innocence would fall. Come the risen dawn, she and her beloved were surrounded by townsfolk, claiming her to be infernal spawn. For a woodsman claimed the witness of a horrid scene in the night, the act of an appalling, unclean rite. By hand and foot she was bound. Despite her wails, no mercy was found. Not even her love spoke to her aid, claiming with the demon he saw her laid. The court's judgment was swift. The extinction of her life declared a boon, a gift. 3 sunsets passed in utter anguish. To a cold, filthy, dark and unforgiving cell she would languish. She looked up to the waxing moon during the last nightfall. Merciful Lord, hear my call. In her heart, she knew she had by God been forsaken. She felt her hope, her joy, and her will to live slowly be taken. Then, from the dark abyssal shadows, he came, bearing the promise that her fate, her soul, would not suffer the same. Take my hand, dear child, for through me may your vengeance upon those who wronged you run wild. With a desperate fear stirring in her breast, she gave heed to his ominous request. She desired only from her present scourging to be spared. The fate of her soul or her fellow kin she no longer cared. Pledge your devotion, child, and by the rising sun of the next morrow, they will all forevermore awaken, only to as one cry to the heavens in sorrow. Higher and higher she watched the flames climb, feeling their unmerciful scorch. She looked to his eyes once more, and knew it was time. Wanderer from beyond, Lord of shadow, I beseech you, deliver me from peril and deliver them into woe. My body, my heart and my soul I will pledge to your every whim. Upon the conclusion of her damning and sacrilegious hymn, she screamed to the sky in agony. The crowd merely looked on in apathy, confident that they'd ridden the land of wickedness. Thus the skies blackened, and over them all was spread a mysterious dreg of sadness. whence the raging element greedily consumed the dry oaken pyre, reducing her to ash and searing her mind, heart and soul by hellfire. They dispersed, a creeping dread eclipsing their former victory. Why and how was still a mystery. Through the darkened beyond she tread, a vile place where even the innocent were bled. Pervading the void around her, she heard their anguished cries. Their tears and their screams told no lies. They told her through mind, body and heart how far her soul had fell, for she knew she would now forever tread in hell. The burning sigil of Tartary upon her forehead would mark her heavenly isolation. The last tear she could ever shed was at her utter desolation. Through the seemingly endless eons her conscience grew numb. Slowly to the will of wrath she would succumb. From within her never-ending cycle of woe, she remembered her promise to the demon, wreathed in shadow. Her body, her heart and her soul she would pledge to his every whim. Suddenly, there he stood, her dark seraphim. By my will I have delivered you from God's hands. By my power you shall spread terror upon your once native lands. With her soul empty and her heart bent, she vowed that only when the blood of her persecutors and their descendants soaked the earth would her fury be spent. It was a grave dusk that upon old Willow she came. Her first target, a young and gorgeous dame. The last thing the dame would experience would be crippling fright. In her victim's suffering, Jacqueline took malign delight. The maiden's death did not end the depravity. She fervently revelled in her sheer inhumanity. It mattered not to her how, who, nor when, for she would murder all in the many coming nights. Men, women, and children too. Her wrath knew no limit, felt no bounds. Her enraged shrieks were, for many, her coming sound. Beautiful women she would strangulate. Young men in the night she would violate. And children, the sweet and innocent lads and lasses, in large shallow pits, they'd be found in masses. In terror, the folk beseeched the aid of the priest. "Save us," they cried, "deliver us from the clutches of this vile beast." When the sun lowered, and once more was replaced by the waxing moon, the priest and his clerics enacted a plan, knowing the vengeful ghost would be coming soon. Wielding their images of Christ's sacrifice and Jacqueline Crow's ashen remains, they resolved to bind her unclean soul to the tree at which she burned, creating her purgatory within the mortal planes. For 3 hours they recited their prayers at the base of Jacqueline's fiery sepulchre. Our Father, who art in heaven, we come to you in this hour of terror. We ask only for your divine aid to bind to this grave oak and deliver to us, your children, from this scourge. Finally, they felt the phantom from the ground beneath emerge. At the sight of them, she attempted to tempt the younger apprentices, promising their pleasure with her to be endless. The priest, not vexed by her facade, commanded in the name of God, "Jacqueline Crow, concubine of Lucifer, I forever condemn you to this oak, your former sepulchre." At this, the enraged witch attempted a vicious attack. At the sight of the priest's cross, she was driven back. Finally, she'd been driven back to the oak. As her body was consumed, in the shadow's name she would evoke. With your pious ways you have brought you and your bleating sheep only slight relief. Even bound, my power will always bring upon you all misery and grief. Remember this, for this tree will always bear this curse. Any of whom who would take its delectable fruit, their bodies will be forfeit for me to traverse. Through them, my power and spirit will thrive anew. With her final declaration, she was finally subdued. The clerics dispersed, returning to their homes, confident that the evil they faced no longer freely roams. Despite their victory, they wouldn't negate the phantom's dying claim, fearful that she may not again so easily be tamed. From each day hence, it was declared that the accursed tree was forbidden, punishable as a high offence. For many moons following, the townsfolk were able to live in bliss, Most of them, seeing the blossoming fruit, found it in them to resist. Such, however, would not last. For an unsuspecting victim, it was supposed that a mysterious temptation was cast. The boon to eat of the cursed fruit was relentlessly insistent. Weary traveller, I sense you are hungry and in need of nourishment. Panic flooded the hearts of the townsfolk when one of the fruits was discovered with a bite. The mounted terror caused some to almost die of fright. Who had unleashed this monster, allowing it once again to wander? None were able to be proven the culprit, he who would forever live as the Lich's puppet. To this very day, there are still none who could say. All that is known is merely this, that somewhere, inside someone, her evil is amiss. When or how her wrath will return, none may ever know. The hour it does will be an hour of anguish and perpetual sorrow, for they will all fall to the rage of Jacqueline Crow, the witch of Old Willow.